Okay, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening. Welcome here to the lecture on the rediscovery, and you'll notice it's in quote marks, of Assyria by Westerners and Orientalism. What are we talking about? Well, before we begin, I'd like to pose a couple of questions to my trusty assistant, Mr. Pierre Yonan. Pierre, there's often discussions of Orientalism in connection with Arabs and Muslims, specifically Edward Said, who was the father of Orientalism, who wrote this book in 1978, often spoke about Palestinians. But he talked a lot about what Orientalism is, and it seems to be a theoretical groundwork for, and a very important one, for understanding the East through the eyes of the West. What, if anything, do you think Orientalism has to do with the Assyrians, if anything, or does it? Does it at all?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with especially how modern historians perceive Assyrians and our heritage. When Westerners were sort of arriving in larger numbers in the East in the 1800s, it was very much this paternalistic attitude to the Assyrians. Oh, look at this Christian minority group. We need to take them under our wing, and they're unable to act with any agency of their own. They're under the mercy of their Muslim overlord. Very much sort of minimizing them, and even their attitude, oh, these people don't really recognize they're Assyrian, we know they're Assyrian. And sort of, modern historians look at this and then say, well, look, they were applied this term Assyrian. They didn't know it for themselves, These people didn't know what they were, they were just an historian. Um, I think that was sort of an attitude, and very much a simplistic look at Assyrian people and our literature. You still see this to this day. Like recently, I was reading a paper about Christology, and it said that the Syriac language was very simple and unable to really grasp Christology. And
Wow.
this attitude, I had said the same thing when I read the sentence. Uh,
I'd love to know
you know,
the name of the author of that.
You know what, Robbie? I'll send it right to you as soon as we finish this. But it's very much an attitude that has permeated academia. That these people, they're very simple. They're unable to sort of have any agency of their own or make do for themselves. And you see it in the post-war period after World War One. The West has to take care of the Assyrians, and we'll decide what's best for them. If we want to settle them, in the swamp north of Homs, Syria, then that's where we're going to settle them. Or, if they need to go to Brazil, maybe that's where they belong. This is very much something that I found very interesting and looking at how
So,
Europeans perceive us.
so don't you think that's kind of like part and parcel of the whole like view? It's about that lens, European lens that Edward Said talks about for the entire East.
Absolutely, it's applicable to Assyrians. Absolutely. Just because we're not part of the Arab group, and because Edward Said doesn't reference us by name, doesn't mean that it's not very, very applicable. And it's not that Orientalism doesn't have some problems, and there have been critiques of it, as you brought up in the first episode that we did. But it's applicable to Assyrians, I think, many points of it.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. And I think that well, I have tremendous respect for Edward Said. He was an incredible intellectual, public intellectual, and a very talented man, very perceptive. Um, but he also, you're right, he didn't speak of the Assyrians specifically, but he did refer to this view of Westerners toward the East as, kind of wholesale. It's a general theory that applies in the context of, and we're going to go over the kind of the historical context in the context of, empire and taking over the East and exploiting the East and understanding the East and dominating the East as a whole. And Assyrians, of course, are a part of the East. Now, another thing that Westerners did was come to the East and dig up various ruins, various artifacts, various sites, and specifically with regard to the Assyrians, you had people that we're going to talk about today, Bota and Laird and others, who dug up Assyrian sites in the 1840s, 1830s, and 1840s. What does this have to do with this digging up of ancient Assyrian history? Have to do with, if at all, with your people, um, Pierre, who lived in either Hakkari or the Nineveh Plain or Tor Abdin or anywhere, not specifically the Church of the East, but all.
Yeah, this is sort of an interesting thing. I think from the Orientalist lens, it's very, they like to connect these events to a national awakening. I think specifically, you like Becker likes to point it out with Protestant missions that start to arrive in this region as sort of leading to this whole thought process of nationalism, more than just the excavations. But I find myself often when I'm looking at people who are separatists in our community, they always love to point out Laird. He's the father of the Assyrians, identifying as this, or whatever he wants to, whatever the person making the argument wants to refer to our people as. Um, it's very much something that they like to tie to this. But what did the people, for example, like you said to me, like me as a Tumnaya, what did my people have to do with Laird? Very little, nothing, if nothing. I often look at Melik Loko's book, The Assyrian Struggle for National Survival. Melik Loko was very proud to be an Assyrian, and yet he was actually very anti-British at the same time. He's someone that rejected uh, what the British had done to the Assyrian community. So it's very much this attitude that the British imposed this, or that these British explorers put this idea on us. Well, there were people who were anti-English who lived, maybe 50, 70 years after this happened, but they rejected this sort of British influence. At the same time, they identified as being Assyrian. These two concepts could be separated. And I think when we go more into this discussion, we're going to see about how certain people on their own identified, including, I think, Hormis Rassam or the people of Kharput, when asked about who their identity is and who they are. And I think very much it's just an attempt to link, oh, okay, well, they're excavating and they really wanted this Christian minority group to be that, even though they're not that,
You mean
it's very much,
link to the ruins, and they're not really
yeah,
linked to the,
it's
yeah.
it's just drawing lines where there aren't lines because, again, our people are not so simple as to just, well, let's just start calling ourselves that.
Mm.
We're not that simple. And this was something that crossed all our denominations. I often think, who were the founders of the modern Assyrian, nationalist thought? It was people in Torabdin. It was people in this area. It was in the Western Assyrians. They did not have the British influence there, or all the Chaldean Catholics who prominently displayed Assyrianism. Were they involved with the British?
Yeah.
It's a really silly thing to even think about at times, but that's a discussion for another day.
Okay, well, I'm going to touch on a lot of what you said throughout the lecture, but I also want to ask you something just to kind of think about along those lines. Why is it legitimate for Greeks and, say, other Europeans to have learned nationalism from each other, okay, from the British, from the French, um, and it's not okay for Assyrians to have learned it from the British or the French? Why is that a problem?
It,
Just think about that. Yeah, I don't want your answer now. Just let's go through this discussion, this lecture, and then I want others to weigh in on it. But you think about it in the context of what we kind of talked about, Pierre. Okay, everybody. So today we're going to talk about the discovery of Assyria by Westerners, and I call it rediscovery, and I'm kind of putting it in quote marks for a reason, because was it really a discovery or a rediscovery? And what does Orientalism have anything to do with what we're talking about? And I asked a couple of questions of Pierre, and he gave very good answers, and I'm going to add to it. So, what was the motive all these Westerners came to the East, came to specifically to Assyria, to Mesopotamia and Persia, and they were looking for, through these ruins, what was their motive? Well, one clear motive, as many of them would actually talk about it, is the biblical validation. They wanted to make sure that, or check on the Bible. Was it true? Were these figures in the Bible real human beings who lived? Remember that the Renaissance in Europe had been flowering and had flowered, and many people were thinking along more scientific lines than religious lines. But there were some looking at this history and asking themselves, could this be true? So, why did the Assyrians come into this? Why did their history come into it? Because the Assyrians play a big part in the Hebrew Bible. They're a very important element. There's imperial prestige to talk about here. European powers wanted to have control, to possess these areas, and to possess their history in turn. There was scientific curiosity, as I said, and there is this idea of Orientalism controlling the East through controlling knowledge of it. There's a very good play, by the way, that is given in Chicago, and I think it's here until the 20th. Today's the 17th of July, called Iraq But Funny. And one of the lines of the character in this play is this, he's called the English gentleman, is, I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to give you the narrative because these people are not capable of giving you the narrative. So it's a very Orientalist view that he takes. Of course, it is a comedy, a dark comedy, and the character is kind of a farcical character, but he stands for the West. He stands for specifically the British Empire. So let's put all of this in the context of what was going on in the world. I mean, nothing happens in a vacuum. So Napoleon takes over Egypt. He wants to challenge the British Empire. The battle is between the British and the French. And it's within this context, the Ottoman Empire is kind of like undergoing difficulties. It hasn't mastered modernization yet. It is struggling to do so, and it's going to try to do that a little later. Napoleon invades, and we see the Middle East as a very important strategic area, and it's going to become even more important in the years to come. Well, Napoleon did one more thing in connection with what we're talking about today. He brought 160 scholars with him to Egypt. When he went to Egypt, he took these scholars. Very strange. Why would he take these scholars? What's the point of this? Well, imperial and colonial legitimacy, to establish that our knowledge is better than the British, scientific curiosity and Enlightenment ideas. Again, religion is becoming less and less important. Now it's curiosity, although not for everyone. Rivalry, of course, with Britain, and control through knowledge. This is what we term proto-Orientalism at the beginning of it. And Orientalism, as we've said before, is a book that was written by Edward Said, who is a Palestinian Christian, in 1978. And he, through this idea, he means to speak as to the superiority of the West when it looks at the East. He speaks to the patronizing attitude of the West. In his analysis, the West views the Middle East as a static area, as underdeveloped, and it fabricates a view of a Oriental culture that can be studied, depicted, and reproduced in the service of imperial power. So everything is coming from the imperial power or the Western power. And if you think about the situation today, one could say nothing has really changed. The perspective that he had, this very observant intellectual. And of course, as Pierre said, there was criticism, and there is criticism. And sometimes we we see things that don't quite fit into the theory of Orientalism. And I'm going to mention a couple of things today. So implicit in this fabrication, he tells us, is the idea that Western society is developed, rational, flexible, and superior. This allows Western imagination to see the Eastern cultures and peoples as both alluring and a threat to Western civilization. So what does it do? And we'll speak in the context of Assyrians a little later, but what does it do? It defines the East as fundamentally different, something that we call othering, as much as I dislike using that word, but it's very handy to use this expression of othering. The West constructed the East as irrational, passive, backward, exotic, sensual, dangerous, in contrast to the West as rational, active, progressive, disciplined, and moral. And this binary you hear from even many Assyrians today, or many Easterners. I heard a cousin of mine who happens to be German and Assyrian, and I asked her, she was very active doing various things. I'm not going to mention her name. I'm just going to say I asked her, where do you get the energy? She said, it's my German side. And what's the German side? It is rational, it is active, it is moving, it is doing things. Well, what's your Assyrian side? Well, a little bit, not so active, not so rational, not so energetic. Creates knowledge as a form of power. The West did not just describe the East, it defined and produced it. So we control this narrative. Who are the experts? They're going to be, of course, European. They're going to be Western experts. Why should they be Western? Well, they're more intelligent and more observant and more rational in their view of the East. It justified colonial rule by portraying, remember the mandate system, by portraying Easterners as unable to care for themselves, Easterners in general, of course, incapable of self-rule, incapable of building and maturing and so on and so forth. The West was there to govern them and to engage in a civilizing mission. And meanwhile, while they're there, they could take the resources of the land. It freezes the East in time. The Orient is often depicted as unchanging. The East never changes. And think about this very deeply when we talk about the Assyrians and the observation made about modern and ancient Assyrians. While the ancient Assyrians were a certain way and the modern Assyrians are a certain way, is there this view that the East is unchanging or should be unchanging? Serves Western psychological and cultural needs, and establishes institutional control. So Edward Said tells us Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. Now, the Westerners began to discover the East, which included at this time areas in the Ottoman Empire that are Greece or Anatolia. And these are some of the personalities involved, just so you have a general view. So Belzoni was a traveler. He was at one point the strong man in a circus, but he loved Egypt. He went to Egypt, discovered certain tombs and temples. Remember, the search of these early people was really for treasure, less so, deep scientific archaeological knowledge. It was more for treasure. But all of these people kind of contributed. We have to give them credit also for discovering. Not everything is bad about what we're talking about here. Niebuhr dealt with Persia and Mesopotamia in the 1760s, very early on. Claudius Rich with Babylon, the city of Babylon and Assyria. and Schliemann, famous for discovering Troy. There's a long history there of falsifying history, but generally these archaeologists dug into the East and discovered, one could say, the East, or discovered the ruins of Assyria and Assyria. One very early character was the Italian traveler. Italians like to travel a lot, Marco Polo and company, is Pietro della Valle. He is one of the first to kind of describe the ruins of ancient Assyria. And he says in one of his passages, to that city anciently called Nineveh in Assyria. So he knew, of course, through the Bible, but he also pointed out that there was knowledge of this area. By the way, he refers to an Assyrian girl that marries an Italian during this time in the early 1600s. And he refers to her as a young Assyrian, 18-year-old Assyrian. To that city anciently called Nineveh in Assyria, which we found in the prophecy of Jonah, was sometimes a great and excellent city of 3 days' journey, but now so exceedingly lessened, meaning ruined, and lodged in obscurity that passengers cannot say of it, this was Nineveh, which now hath its old name changed and is called Mosul. Now, remember, Mosul is on the western bank of the Tigris. Nineveh is on the eastern bank of the Tigris. So the two are not technically the same. And a lot of people mistake the two for being the same exact city. They're not. Mosul is not Nineveh. Nineveh is not Mosul. But now, just to kind of confuse things a little bit, the entire governorate, the state, is called Nineveh. The city is called Mosul on the western bank of the Tigris, and the ancient city of Nineveh is on the eastern side of the Tigris. Carsten Niebuhr was a Danish-German explorer, another early explorer, cartographer, mathematician. He contributed to the field of archaeology and Assyriology, even though he did not formally call himself, nor was there a field called Assyriology. He traveled to Persepolis, copied cuneiform inscriptions. Now, the difference between Persepolis and Nineveh, for example, is Nineveh lay buried underneath, largely because of the weather and because of the environment in the area. So its ruins were buried, its monuments, its incredible structures were buried. Persepolis was not. Persepolis had a dry environment, and you could still see the columns standing. So Persepolis was much more of a marked area than Nineveh was. Now, what he found later was used to decode Assyrian writing, cuneiform writing. And we're going to talk about who actually started decoding cuneiform. This was a very important development in Assyriology. Although he did not understand cuneiform, his copies made it possible for others to take first real steps in deciphering this. And this led to breakthroughs in Akkadian and Assyrian cuneiforms, and scholars like Henry Rawlinson and others began to translate ancient Assyrian texts. And these are, up until today, fairly accurate, although there are some changes that should be made to them and have been by scholars. By the way, many of the cuneiform writings, scholars in the early days would write some things, and some are completely off, but many are fairly accurate and they just need kind of modifying. But scholars are continually looking at them and retranslating them, as it were. Claudius Rich was working for the East India Company, which is a whole story by itself. The East India Company, that's a very fascinating story. A very powerful company, in quote marks, corporate entity. Was a resident in Baghdad and one of the earliest Western explorers of Mesopotamia. He played a key role in reviving European interest in ancient Assyria. So very important. His writings are among the earliest systematic accounts of the ruins of Nineveh and Babylon, so Assyria and what we came to know as Babylonia. He offered highly detailed observations regarding the ancient Assyrians. He was fascinated and speculative concerning modern Assyrians. He wrote with a mix of curiosity, respect, and Orientalist detachment. He was a very depressed individual, by the way, and later got on the opium. Uh, um, he was hooked on opium in Egypt. A very interesting character, by the way. We could talk about him in one entire class because he went through a lot of depression and thought that people that were indolent are intelligent, or people that were intelligent were very indolent. He met Disraeli from England. They hung out in Egypt. Um, Now, what is very important about him is he wrote a narrative of a journey to the site of Babylon in 1811, so fairly early. He wrote a narrative of residence in Kurdistan on the site of and on the site of ancient Nineveh. It was posthumously published by his widow. He talked about the modern Assyrians, referring to them as Nestorians. And one is kind of like what we know now. We sort of wonder, all of these people referred to themselves as Surai, whether they were in the Nineveh plain or in the Hakkari Mountains, or they just belonged to different churches, or in the Tor Abdin area. They all refer to themselves as Surai. And some people caught that as, well, that obviously that means Assyrian, and some didn't. And so they were very confused. And one of those confused will look at what he says about this issue of identity. A very important personality in Assyrian history is also Paul Emile Botta, 1802 to 1870, pioneering French counsel and archaeologist who played a foundational role. Now, this is kind of the beginning of Assyriology. He dug up Nineveh. He wasn't very successful, so he went to what's called Khorsabat or Dur Sharukin, and he discovered a lot there. And he was amazed. And at first, he thought it was Nineveh. Of course, that is another city that was not Nineveh. Dur Sharukin was the city that Sargon II had built for his royal residence, and it was to be the capital of Assyria, and it was for a very short period of time. And then his son, of course, Sennacherib, transfers the Assyrian capital to the great city of Nineveh. So again, very important, publishes his works, and Botta is a very important beginning foundational character of Assyriology. But really, the best known of all of these people is Henry Layard. Henry Layard had a lot to do with the growth of the discovery of these areas. And Henry Layard was loosely called an archaeologist. We have to be careful with this term during this time because he really did not have the scientific background, but he certainly was a diplomat. He was a writer, a very good writer, and he played a foundational role in the study of the Assyrians and the broader field of Eastern archaeology, Near Eastern archaeology. He was very dramatic in his display of various finds that he located. He was really looking for larger finds, more visible finds, more, bling blingy items, and not really digging into the history. And oftentimes, according to modern, or recent historians, he kind of like ruined certain areas because he was really digging very deep for very ancient monuments rather than kind of understanding the layered history of Assyria. So he excavated major Assyrian sites. Nimrud is one of them. He discovered the famous Northwest Palace, what came to be known as Northwest Palace of Ashur-nasir-pal II. This was an incredible structure, by the way, this was like a major innovation, a king having a palace like this, a major step in the enlargement of the Assyrian Empire and its empowering. So, kind of architecturally describing for you the movement towards the larger stage of empire during this time. So, Layard's responsible for that. Also, Nineveh. He moved to excavate Nineveh, uncovering Palace of Sennacherib, what Sennacherib called the Palace Without Rival, which was where Stephanie Dalley, the late Stephanie Dalley, said were the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh, not the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Stephanie Dalley believed that the Hanging Gardens were the work of King Sennacherib, not the work of Nebuchadnezzar II, Sanchiru, not the Nebuchadnezzar II, because there is much evidence for that. So Layard discovered the palace of Sennacherib. He also discovered the library of Ashurbanipal and carried a lot of this stuff to England. With authorization, without authorization, he carried a lot of this stuff to England. Reintroduced Assyria to the Western world. So something that was kind of damped down, the Western world didn't know about it. Assyria was kind of covered with soil. What I'm talking about are the ruins of Assyria, not the people. Although he himself said these Nestorians and these Chaldean Nestorians and others, he didn't distinguish between them, are a part of Assyria as much as the ruins of Assyria are a part of the Assyria. I mean, Layard made this point. So his books illustrated very well what he had discovered. By the way, a lot was lost. For example, Assyrian reliefs were placed on a boat a number of times and they were damaged and sunk under the Tigris. Many were ruined because of the lack of care, really, in a lot of these places. But in the end, Assyria was popularized, and many of these things, as I said, were shipped to England. And this supported the study of Assyriology and Assyrian writings. And in particular, one very prominent person was Ralston, who studied the works of the Assyrians. Now, another thing that Layard did was he inspired the creation, duplication of Assyrian art in England, in London. And we see here is a sketch of what was called the Nineveh Court. And it was part of a larger kind of gathering of Persian, Egyptian, and other areas. But what they created was this very interesting area to visit. And he's quoted here saying, if any proof were needed of the general interest in general interest excited by the discoveries of Assyria, in Assyria, it is to be found in the attempt made to give the public a restoration of the palace of an Assyrian king at the Crystal Palace, this particular area. So this is sort of a display. Why are these winged bulls colored? All Assyrian reliefs were colored, and as were Roman and Greek. They weren't just, white marble or gray marble or granite sculptures without color. Many of these were very vividly colored. So you get kind of an idea, and I think there are some mistakes made here architecturally, but artistically, at least the winged bulls have come out fairly close to what historians think was pretty accurate. One of the things about Layard to note is that he was very imaginative, and he had a very powerful kind of vision of the work that he was doing. And he tells us in Nineveh and its remains, I had entered that great temple in which their kings had worshipped and had stood where they had stood more than 25 centuries ago. The writings on the walls were to me as a sealed book, but I felt that I was now among the monuments of a mighty nation. So he had a great admiration for what he was discovering. He also had a sense of great importance and relevance in his role in bringing back this civilization that was hidden for many centuries. This great elite civilization, as it were, and this is the comment that he made. One of the people he inspired and helped along was Rawlson, who, by the way, you mentioned Hormuz Rassam, and we'll get to him. Rawlson didn't like Hormuz Rassam, but here in Rawlson, we have the person we can call the father of Assyriology, and he played a very central role in deciphering the script, the ancient cuneiform script, worked very hard at it. How it happened was the Behistun inscription was in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. And like the Rosetta Stone, this was kind of an opportunity to kind of compare and contrast and figure out this very strange script that people were coming across. And the decipherment of Akkadian then took place. He worked with copies, squeezing impressions, and Rawlson and others, notably Edward Hinks, and others worked to understand the logographic and syllabic nature of the Babylonian and Akkadian script. In 1857, a test was arranged where Rawlson and three other scholars independently translated an Akkadian inscription, and the test translation of a cylinder of Tughlaq-Pileser the First. Their translations were remarkably similar, as the translations are still today. They still stand today by and large, with some modifications. And he first began to translate these into English, and these were the royal inscriptions. And he co-published cuneiform inscriptions in Western Asia, 5 volumes, with the British Museum, and these were a very important work for Assyriologists. And he translated what is known as the Prism of Sennacherib, and this was his early work. This prism is an extraordinary object. There are 3 of them, by the way. And in it, he translates, as for Hezekiah the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong-walled cities. Now, this was very interesting because many scholars thought that this sort of verified the biblical account of the story of Sennacherib coming to Judah. Of course, the term Hezekiah the Jew was wrong, and it's been retranslated Hezekiah the Judean. That's a more accurate translation. And there are other smaller mistakes, but by and large, Rawlson made a tremendous impact on the field. Now, having known about these, and I'm going to talk about Hormuz Rassam because I want to put him in a special kind of category. What is, to go back to what I had asked Pierre, how can we contextualize views of the Assyrians within this larger theory of Orientalism, which is very important? And today, until today, really, it's been discussed. Well, how does it view the Assyrians? And one could say the ancient Assyrians were viewed as a dead civilization, as if discontinued from their modern descendants. Western archaeologists and scholars treated the ancient Assyrians as completely separate, exotic people that were dead and long gone. And of course, there's much time between ancient Assyrians and modern Assyrians, but to view them as completely separate was a little bit of a stretch here, but it was done. Their monuments, writings, and empires were often romanticized or vilified, mostly vilified, with no regard to the idea that any living descendants might still exist. Although, as I said, what doesn't quite fit into this is that Layard said these Assyrians are as much part of Assyria as the ruins of Assyria are. And this fits into kind of the general Orientalizing pattern of freezing Eastern people in time and saying, remember, we said this before, the East is kind of frozen. So ancient Assyria is kind of frozen. We don't look at it as a an entity that continued on. Living Assyrians are treated as relics or exceptions. When modern Assyrians begin to assert a connection to ancient Assyria, Westerners often dismiss these claims as delusional or politically motivated. Well, you're calling yourself Assyrian because you're a nationalist, and argued against Assyrian continuity, portraying Assyrians as a Christian sect with no real link to ancient past or ancient Assyria. This also reflects kind of the way that Orientalists had viewed the Assyrian people. Western control of the Assyrian historical narrative. We will tell the story, as I said in the beginning of the class when we talked about the English gentleman, as I said in that play, who said, well, I will tell the narrative of the Assyrians or the Iraqis because I, the British gentleman, know the story and I can tell it much better because they don't know how to talk. They don't know how to tell their story. Dismissal of modern Assyrian identity as a nationalist myth, as I said. When Assyrians try to claim continuity, they're frequently accused of myth-making or engaging in ethno-nationalist fabrication. Well, one of those very respected figures is J.F. Coakley, who wrote the book on the relations between the Church of the East and the Church of England. And he says in one of his passages, I refer here to the reference of the word Assyrian, to the link created between the modern Assyrians, and he's got us in quote marks, and the ancient Assyrians. In short, the name Assyrian is now inseparable from a whole bogus ethnology. Bogus ethnology is a reference to Assyrians linking themselves with the ancient past. And he's not the only one, of course. Adam Becker, who you brought up, Pierre, wrote in this book, Revival and Awakening, modern Assyrians learned that they are the Syrian nation, Suraye, the Suraye, Surieta. They learned this through the interactions with missionaries. This then Syrian nation became Assyrian. So Suraye became Aturaya, as if the two are completely separate and have nothing to do with each other. And we're going to talk more in this class, and I hope you asked the question because I was asked before and a while ago, a couple of years ago maybe, and I didn't know how to quite answer this question. Well, what's the difference between Suraya and Aturaya? Why is there this separation? And of course, now we have another term thrown in the pot, which is Ashuraya. Ashuraya, Aturaya, Suraya. What's the difference? Well, according to Adam Becker, he thinks that this was all concocted, and this was really the work of the interaction of modern Assyrians with, in particular, evangelical Christians from the West. And he goes through this long, very long-winded, completely incomprehensible diatribe about how these missionaries thought and what they thought, the evangelicals, and how this impacted the Assyrians. And I'm sorry, to this day, I fail to see the nexus. I've read his book. I just don't see it. I see the influence, of course, but that could have been written in 2 pages.
You know, it's funny. The people who he cites often have a very Orientalist attitude toward the Assyrians they're interacting with. You know, these are very simple people. I'm trying to remember specifically. He's talking about one missionary who goes and takes this, oh, what's his name? I feel like it starts with a P. He takes this bishop, I'm gonna put bishop in quotes, to America and then back to
Perkins,
Iran.
Perkins.
Perkins is like, oh, these people are so simplistic and
Yes,
stupid and
yes, yes,
backwards, and it's
yes.
it's it's so funny. And yet Becker cites this person like he's the Bible, like Perkins is the absolute truth, and it's funny. It's very funny to me.
Well, it's very Orientalist. Really, it's the he's the expert. Perkins is the expert. I mean, part of it, to give Becker a little bit of leeway here, part of it is that Perkins was much more articulate, and whereas the bishop was not, he didn't write a lot of these things. but I'm sure if we sat with both men, Perkins and the bishop, and that's Mario Hanan of Urmia, I'm sure if we sat with them, they would have given us more, I would say, nuanced, um, nuanced explanations as to identity and so on. Um, but no one is more crude and crass and unforgiving than David Wilmshurst, who is just shockingly racist and bad. And in his book, um, yeah, bad when it comes to this issue, by the way, but he does very good research, as far as
In
I can
terms of his
tell.
history of the Church of the East and
Yeah, I mean
its understanding of it. Yeah,
documenting manuscripts and so on and so forth. But
population
he's
statistics, great.
yeah, but Pierre, he's also, if you read him carefully, he also makes real incredibly high school like comments about characters, Assyrian characters such as Marsham, who he'll say, like, for example, the guy, this was a comical character. The guy died 200 years ago. You don't know him. You don't know, this was not a very intelligent person, so on and so forth. Um, but he says, of modern Assyrians linking themselves with the past, that their modern literature is shrill and bombastic. One longs for the day when Assyrian writers will find more attractive themes than the grievance of the Assyrian nation. Oh, so they're saying, we went through this genocide, we went through this horrible Holocaust in the First World War, and we're writing about it in poetry. And just David Wilmshurst doesn't like it. He's annoyed by it. He doesn't want to hear it. And so we hear that today about other groups of people, of course. And he says very incredibly, I don't know how someone got through with this comment that Assyrians are, they claim Assyrian descent, but they're really thoroughly mongrel and have been for centuries. Now, mongrel is something used for dog breeds. I have not heard a person talk about people like this for centuries, I think. But he uses it, and it is completely inappropriate. So Orientalism does apply to the Assyrians and doesn't just apply to Arabs and Muslims. It applies to wherever the Western systems of knowledge have claimed authority to define the East. We know how to tell your story. So it severs the link between ancient and modern. It distorts historical interpretation. It denies agency, as you referred, Pierre, and Assyrians telling their own story, and it reinforces the control outsiders have over the past of the Assyrians. Now, in all of this, let's ask this question. Who was this man, Hormuz Rassam? So he was part of this, he kind of like gives us an exception to the rule, an exception to this theory, almost. He was born in 1826 and died in 1910. Born to an Assyrian Christian family, often described himself as a Chaldean or Assyrian, and he did not distinguish between the two. He thought the two were the same. He spoke Syriac, Arabic, Turkish, and later English fluently. He was the first to become involved in archaeology among the Assyrians with Austin Henry Layard, and he hired him as an assistant during excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh. He did a lot of work in Nimrud. Eventually, he was sent to Oxford University with Layard's assistance for formal education. He's the nephew of Christian Rassam. By the way, Christian Rassam, and I'll just mention a couple of things today, because during these times, the Assyrians of Hakkari were undergoing momentous changes and tragedies. This was the time of Badr Khan Beg and the massacres of Nurallah and Badr Khan. So, on the one hand, there were these discoveries of the Assyrian past, and on the other, great tragedies to the largest segment of Assyrians, which I'm going to talk about. But more on Rassam, because we need to understand his contributions, which have been lessened in various historical records. He was the lead excavator in the 1850s to 1870s. He unearthed major archaeological treasures, including further portions of the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, where there were thousands of cuneiform tablets. He's the one who found the Epic of Gilgamesh tablet, important finds in Sippar, Babylon, and Borsippa, expanding knowledge not just the Assyrian heartland. One of the earliest known Mesopotamian legal texts, the Tablet of Shemesh from Sippar, continued excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh, clarifying structures and historical layers, first uncovered by Layard. Now he comes back, and these discoveries deepened scholarly understanding of Mesopotamian history, law, mythology, and literature. Advancement of cuneiform studies, Rassam's findings provided the textual material used by philologists like George Smith, who, by the way, when he discovered the story of the flood, took off his clothes and ran around, almost went insane because he had found something that was in the Bible, the story of the flood, different version of it, and was made possible by a tablet found by Rassam. So Rassam, the Assyrian, finds this tablet of the flood. He was a diplomat and mediator. He also served British diplomatic service in the Middle East. His dual identity as a native of the region and an agent of British imperial interest gave him unique access and credibility among locals and colonial authorities alike. Now, at this time, I want to stress that the Assyrian people were divided into these areas: Nineveh Plain and Duhok, which was a large segment of the Assyrian people; Hakkari, which was ruled by the Assyrians, almost self-rule, kind of an autonomous self-rule. The world was changing now. European modernization was well underway, and the Ottoman Empire was trying to modernize. As these digs are going on, Assyrians also lived in Harput, in Baghdad, and other places, but largely the units of the Assyrian population were in the Tur Abdin area, some stretching all the way to Diyarbakir, in the Hakkari area, which was the largest compact population of Assyrians, the Urmia area, Salama, Suldus, Urmia, and then the Nineveh Plain. Well, as this is going on, also one man is trying to kind of consolidate Assyrian power in this certain area, and that is Mar Oraham Shummun, who is the patriarch of the Church of the East in the Hakkari area, and also kind of the leader of the Assyrians of Hakkari, wielding a lot of power, more power among these particular Assyrians than any held by, say, Assyrians of Urmia or Tur Abdin or the Nineveh Plain. So here you have a compact area, a patriarch able to wield a lot of violent power in this Hakkari area and maybe even outside of it. So gather thousands of Assyrian warriors.
And you might even say he was the most powerful patriarch in a long time. Since
Yes.
prior to him, the tribal leaders had quite a bit of say over the patriarch, and the patriarch would have mostly functioned almost as another tribal leader in charge of his own certain area, which we might call Shemizdin and that whole Nochia area. But due to his efforts, he was able to consolidate much authority under the seat of the patriarchate in Kochanes.
Well, he was, I would say more than that. He was trying, as the situation was changing, as within the Hakkari area, there was a struggle between Nurullah and his nephew. And this struggle was, while it was going on, Assyrians sensed themselves, he specifically sensed himself as becoming more powerful. There was certainly potential for him to become the first guy in the Hakkari area. And he felt that with the power that he had and the relationship that he had with Ottoman authorities, he could establish himself a legitimate, something like perhaps a state. So he's struggling with outside oppression as well as internal division between the tribes. There's hostility between Assyrians and the Kurdish emirs, as I mentioned. aggravated recently by the present patriarch grasping after a degree of power, and this is Lori, a degree of power said to have been unknown to his predecessors. So, Pierre, this is a very important point, that Marshimon was trying to consolidate. And it's rather interesting. One would expect him to have been aware of the conditions outside. And of course, Assyrians did communicate with outside powers. They communicated with the king of Georgia. They communicated with the Tsar. They communicated with other Christians to see if they could be helped. And and the Laurie says here, as he possessed no little diplomatic tact and energy, the jealousy of the Kurds was full as great as it had ever been. So there was much jealousy, and specifically with Nurullah and Suleiman Bey, who was his nephew. As the struggle was going on, we see why the Mir or Amir of Hakkari, the kind of leader of this area, and of course there's the Mir of the Hakkari was a Muslim. Now it could have easily been the case, and Claudius Rich says that the Assyrians were so powerful in the Hakkari Mountains that they could have easily replaced the Kurds. They could have possessed the entire area of the Hakkari. So revered were their warriors in Truma and Tiari and other places. I want to give props to Truma a little bit here. Now, at some point, he goes to Ashitha, the patriarch, and there's great commotion in the village. This is the largest village actually in the Hakkari area, largest Assyrian village. It's a very important village. It is still inhabited today, by the way, but it's entirely Kurdish. And he gives a talk, and he says, and this is very important to know what's going on, because we're going to tie what's happening to the Assyrian ruins and what's happening to the Assyrian people. That's never been done before. The two are separate, and as east is east and west is west, and the twain shall never meet. One of the writers, British writers, says. But this is very important to know, because a lot of the people in the Hakkari, by the way, were working with Layard as laborers. And he says specifically in certain areas, he refers to them oftentimes as Chaldean mountaineers of Tiari and Jilu and Truma, because they were physically stronger than the people of the plains, and they were able to help dig up the large sculptures and stuff, whereas the Arabs were used for carrying soil away from. This is the description given by Layard. So he gives this talk, and this is a very important talk, and he says, he asks the people in Ashitha, because there's a lot of division within the Assyrian people, and he's trying to kind of quell the division, and he's trying to strengthen the Assyrian loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan through Muhammad Pasha, which is in Mosul, who's stationed in Mosul, and not to be allied with the Kurds that are seeking to cause havoc and to kind of pull him to their side. Friends and brethren, I am come here or hither on business of the government, on business of Muhammad Pasha of Mosul. It remains for you to decide whether you will cede to my position at once, or whether you will detain me here 40 days longer. And of course, everybody tells him, they bow to him and tell him, you are upon our heads, you have come. They tell him these Assyrian expressions, and these are expressions of loyalty and respect. And he says, your words incline me to believe that you are my obedient followers. And why should it not be so? Other villages accuse me of partiality to you, and you all know my affection for you. Cries of, we are your servants, we are your subjects. Yet I fear that there are some among you who are not faithful. Some there are even at Ashitha who do as they please, follow what leader they please, and acknowledge no other authority than their own. Tell me, whose subjects are you? Are you under the control of Nurullah Beg of Hakkari, or Muhammad Pasha of Mosul, or of Badr Khan of Jazeera and Botan, or of Zinar Beg? Cries then to Marshumun's statement of, we are your slaves or servants, we will die for you. Now, what's going on here? Clearly, the patriarch is trying, this is not a religious call. This is a clear call for the strengthening of a kind of a creation of a pyramid structure, a state structure, a central structure for the Assyrians and the Hakkari to be led by the house of the patriarch. It is a call for an agreement that we have to be more central and we have to follow. Who are we following? The patriarchy, not necessarily me, but we have to follow the order. And we as the Assyrian people of the Hakkari Mountains, led by Marshumun, are dealing with Muhammad Pasha, who is a servant of the Sultan, who is the Sublime Porte in Istanbul, and not anybody else. So we don't want any rebellion. We don't want to deal with Badr Khan or others. The world is changing. The Ottoman Empire is becoming stronger, and this will be demonstrated, but there will be a lot of bloodshed. So in the spring and summer of 1843, Nurullah and Badr Khan look south towards Zainur Bey, who was the enemy of the Assyrians, caused the Assyrians a lot of problem. Nurullah sends a message to the Pasha, telling him that there is a fortress in Ashitha, and this was either a great misunderstanding or misinformation or disinformation, because Grant had built a school in Ashitha, not a fortress in Ashitha, but these rebels are making it seem like this was kind of contesting the Ottomans' power in this area. So Muhammad Pasha assures Badr Khan and the rest that he would not interfere in his war against the Assyrians. So you hear now the patriarch saying, we are loyal to Muhammad Pasha to the Ottomans, and you hear the Ottomans themselves assuring the Kurds that if you fight the Assyrians, we're not going to interfere. Nurullah and Badr Khan insist that Marshumun give up all political or temporal power and the Assyrians accept Nurullah as their emir, because Nurullah had been, again, contesting with his nephew. Suleiman Bey sends message to Tiari to surrender. Eventually, his nephew also joins in, and Diz is attacked, and then Chumba of Tiari. And a great massacre results. We're not going to go into the horrible situation of the Assyrians, but this was a moment where the Assyrians were trying to centralize through the power of Mar Ora Hamshumun and failed utterly. So we don't need to go into Claudius Rich. A lot of the Assyrian ruins that were found were shipped to England. The British protested what had happened to the Assyrians to the Ottomans. Meantime, they were picking up a lot of these sculptures and taking them to Britain. And again, we return to Hormuz Rassam, who took a lot of pride. He was different than a lot of these Westerners who dug up Assyrian history. And he took a lot of pride in the fact that he belonged to the race that built Nineveh. And he saw no separation, by the way, between the word Chaldean and the word Assyrian. So you would say the Chaldeans of Assyria or the Chaldeans of Nineveh. He understood.
I have the quote that he says, if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Okay, in the Journal of Transactions of the Victoria Institute, I'll post it in the chat when I'm done reading it. The inhabitants of Assyria consist now of mixed races: Arabs, Turkomans, Kurds, Yazidis, Jews, and Christians, called Chaldeans and Syrians. The last two named denominations doubtless belong to one nationality, the Assyrian, and they were only distinguished by these two names when they separated consequent upon the theological dispute of the age, namely the Monophysites or Jacobites and the Nestorians.
Great, thank you. And I think he misunderstood that, but at least he's heading in the right direction, and he's linking himself with the digs that he had found. And by the way, he made he made this point repeatedly when he said, "Had I been British, things would have been different. I would have been given much more credit for what I had found. Now, this pride that he had, which was not instilled in him by the British or any Westerner, um, was picked up by Assyrians who in Urmia and in Tor Abdin and in Diyarbakir and other places picked up this pride, picked up the story, began to learn of the digs of the archaeologists, and began to bring back Assyrian fashions, Assyrian literature. Here we have, for example, this was in the 1950s in Baghdad, the Assyrians demonstrated for, this was after the fall of the monarchy in Iraq. Assyrians demonstrated with costumes. One of the great Assyrian writers was William Daniel, Rabbi William Daniel, who wrote with much emotion about Nineveh. Now the Assyrian longing, as we see this more than just a reference to the Bible and the cruelty of the Assyrians, now we see Assyria and Nineveh as kind of the queen of creation, he says, Malik Brita. Um, and he wants to take inspiration from her, and he is putting a voice to Nineveh, and she is telling him in his literature, preach to the nation, my son, next to old Nineveh, build a new Nineveh, Nineveh Khattabni, and whenever you are tired, come lie upon my earth, gather strength from the mighty. Gabarta, min Gabarta shaqlet khela. Um, well, the Assyrians went through another period of upheaval, and saw the destruction of, there's a lot of questions as to who these people were, where did they come from, where did they get these ideas, and of course there are religious explanations to what they did, and other explanations, but the damage done was incredibly uncivilized and unacceptable. And to allow this to go on is also on the hands of those who were in charge of these areas. But the Assyrians were back after the destruction of many of these sites. They were back to reconnect physically and emotionally and intellectually with their ancient past. And for the first time in 2023, there was a march to the city of Ashur, a great demonstration in the Assyrian New Year, sponsored by the Bnei Bet Nahran, which later became had been part of the ADM and became part of the ADM again. And this was a very interesting historical moment. Now, we talked earlier about, just to kind of come full circle, we talked what was the motivation of the British in reaching out to the East and digging up the East and taking it kind of to the West and studying it. Now let's talk a little bit about the Assyrian Renaissance. What are the motives of Assyrians in reaching back to their historical past, very ancient historical past? Well, certainly there's historical continuity and identity, and this is very important. Validation of the continuation of Assyrian history, affirming that Assyrian identity did not disappear, but evolved across the centuries. And remember, when we talked about Layard, we talked about how he had dug specifically for large monuments and kind of forgot the historical layers. Well, that is what the Assyrians address when they talk about this continuity and are searching in manuscripts and little artifacts and other things to show the continuity. After, for example, the fall of Nineveh, come the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Achaemenids, and then the Macedonians, and then the Parthians, and then the Sasanians, and we see the Assyrian existence throughout all of these, and we'll affirm that in this class in various periods. Validation of belonging to a continuous history, strengthening of modern Assyrian identity, acknowledgement of an unbroken narrative, not, as we said before, this orientalizing image of a frozen past that has nothing to do with the modern Assyrians, counteracting historical erasure and fragmentation, and responding to narratives that dismiss or sever modern Assyrians from their ancient past. This is about cultural empowerment, associating modern Assyrians with the greatness of the past to strengthen the present and future. So, drawing inspiration from the achievements of ancient Assyria, such as, for example, we talked about the Hanging Gardens, the Ashurbanipal Library, and later the School of Nasiban or the University at Nasiban, to fuel cultural pride and future aspirations. Reclaiming historical legacy as a tool of empowerment, leveraging the past in national artistic and intellectual revival, building literature, art, music, and scholarship that consciously draws from Assyrian antiquity but moves into the future, as you saw with William Daniel. Educational and moral engagement, learning about the past to close the distance between ancient and modern, promoting awareness of historical continuity to cultivate national identity and purpose. And here you see a picture of the great poet Ninos Aho, very inspirational, who constantly reached back into the past, but to strengthen the present and inspire people to look toward the future. So using history to inspire the collective action and individual inspiration. So this is not just about we as a people in the abstract, it's also about you as an individual. What do you do when you know about all these great achievements that have something to do with you, that are kind of in your lineage? Fostering intergenerational dialogue and memory transmission, bridging gaps between older and younger Assyrians through shared historical narratives. Global context and representation, presenting a coherent Assyrian narrative to the world. So we are in charge of now giving this narrative, advocating for international recognition of Assyrians as an ancient and modern people, and of course, in between, participating in the global discourse on indigenous and ancient peoples, positioning Assyrians alongside other groups with deep historical roots and living cultures, using historical awareness to inform political and human history, human rights advocacy, grounding in modern struggles in a long arc of survival and statehood aspirations. And that's what reaching back and being inspired by what these finds meant to the Assyrians is what this mission is about. Recreating connections with a past that seemed to be severed.